What happens when the most powerful governing body in the galaxy looks at an entire species and says, "You are too dangerous to exist freely among us"? What happens when they draw a line around your home star, park warships at the edge of our solar system, and tell 8 billion people that their fundamental nature, the ability to decide things for themselves, is classified as a threat to civilization? Most species would negotiate, most species would wait, most species would find the correct form, file the correct appeal, and sit quietly while someone else decides their fate. Humans did not do that. This is the story of the day Earth was told to stay and launched anyway. And what one alien observer watching from the other side of that line felt in his chest when he realized that no wall, no fleet, and no decree had ever once in human history successfully answered the question, "What are you going to do when we decide to go anyway?" Stay with me because this story does not end where you think it ends.
The decree came down on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything to the quorum. The quorum did not have Tuesdays. The quorum had consensus cycles and deliberation periods and the long, comfortable stretches of collective thought that Verith had grown up inside like warm water, like a current that was always going somewhere and you never had to decide where. But the humans had Tuesdays. They had Mondays that they hated and Fridays that they loved, and a specific kind of afternoon light in late autumn that they wrote poetry about. And Verith had spent 14 months reading that poetry through long-range cultural intercept arrays and still could not entirely explain why it made something in their thoracic cluster feel tight and strange. The decree came down on a Tuesday, Earth reckoning, and Verith had been the one to transmit it. That was the part they did not mention in reports. That the transmission had been assigned to them specifically because Verith had the highest proficiency rating for human linguistic pattern recognition in the entire enforcement division, and it was considered a mark of respect to deliver significant communications in the target species' own language rather than requiring translation. So it had been Verith voice, or rather, the synthesized approximation of a human voice that their communication array produced, that had spoken the words into Earth's receiving stations 14 months ago. By order of the Galactic Federation Consensus Chamber, unified vote, species represented, 7. The people of Earth, Sol System, are hereby classified under Provision 9 of the Sapient Stability Framework as a cascading volatility risk. Effective immediately, no vessel of human origin or human operation may cross the boundary of the Sol System as defined by the outer Oort cloud perimeter. This classification is subject to reassessment after a minimum period of 50 standard years, pending demonstrated behavioral stabilization. Verith had read it perfectly. Every syllable correctly weighted. Every pause exactly where the human linguistic rhythm required it. They had been watching Earth ever since. The deliberate patience was not a warship. Verith wanted to be precise about that, because the distinction mattered to them in ways that their reporting obligations did not require and their consensus chain did not ask about. The deliberate patience was an observation and enforcement vessel, a category that the Quorum had invented centuries ago precisely because they found the concept of warships philosophically uncomfortable. Warships implied a unilateral decision to apply force. Enforcement vessels implied a collective decision, reached through proper deliberative process, to maintain order. The difference was bureaucratic, but the Quorum believed in bureaucracy the way some species believed in gods. The ship was roughly ovoid, which was the Quorum's preferred shape because it had no forward-facing point, no aggressive geometry, no visual suggestion of direction or intent. It was 200 meters of smooth gray consensus, and it hung at the edge of the Sol System's Oort cloud like a large, patient stone. There were 11 other ships like it along the perimeter, each one crewed by a consensus cell of between 20 and 40 quorum individuals, all of them neurologically linked by the ambient resonance field that quorum biology required the way humans required oxygen. Verith's cell aboard the deliberate patience was 31 individuals. They ate together, slept in adjacency, processed all observations as a shared cognitive event. When one of them saw something disturbing, 31 of them felt it simultaneously. When one of them reached a conclusion, the conclusion was already 31 conclusions by the time it was spoken. It was, by every metric Verith had ever been taught, the correct and healthy way to exist. Verith spent 6 hours a day alone in the observation bay and told no one. This was not permitted, not formally prohibited, The quorum did not have formal prohibitions against solitary observation, because the quorum did not have formal prohibitions against things that did not occur to them to prohibit. It was simply not done. It was not the kind of thing a healthy consensus cell member did. Going somewhere alone to look at something and think about it by yourself, without the immediate processing support of your cell, was a mild form of the severing, that neurological wrongness that came with solo decision-making, and Veritsan's cellmates, if they had known, would have expressed the quorum equivalent of concern, which manifested as a kind of low vibrational hum that you felt in your secondary nerve clusters before anyone said anything. But they did not know, and Veritsan went anyway. The observation bay was a small room at the ship's equator, ringed with sensor display panels and a single wide viewport that looked out into the dark. Veritsan would stand at the viewport. Standing was also slightly unusual for the quorum, who preferred distributed resting postures, and watched the sensor feeds from Earth. 14 months of watching. 422 days of human Tuesdays and Wednesdays and autumn afternoons, and the specific grief of their late-night broadcasts. The humans had not accepted the decree. This was the thing that Veritsan's reports described as behavioral noncompliance, which was accurate the way a photograph of a fire is accurate, technically correct, and entirely missing the heat. The humans had not accepted the decree the way a stone does not accept being dropped. They simply continued being what they were. They launched small probes that the enforcement perimeter turned back within hours. They sent transmissions on every frequency the Federation monitored, not asking for reconsideration. Humans, Veritsan had noticed, did not ask for reconsideration, but stating, in a variety of tones ranging from formal to furious to almost eerily calm, that the decree was invalid, that no external authority had the right to determine the boundaries of human movement, and that Earth intended to contest the classification through whatever means proved necessary. The whatever means part was the part that Veritsan's superiors found most concerning. The quorum had run 11,000 simulations before issuing the containment decree. Veritsan had read all of them. The simulations were thorough, rigorous, and produced by the finest predictive modeling consensus teams in Federation history, and they all agreed on one thing: a species that made unilateral decisions, real unilateral decisions, not the performative individualism that some species displayed while actually following collective norms, was statistically incompatible with the long-term stability of a federation built on consensus governance. It wasn't that humans were violent. Several Federation species had violent histories far more extensive than humanity's. It wasn't that humans were irrational. It was something harder to explain and harder to defend against. Humans decided things. One human, alone, could decide something. Something real, something irreversible, something that changed the situation permanently, and then do it. Without consulting anyone. Without running it through a deliberative process. Without waiting for consensus. They just decided, and then they acted, and the decision was made, and the universe had to live with it. To the quorum, this was not a feature. This was a catastrophic design flaw. It meant that you could never predict what a human would do by modeling what humans as a group would do, because at any moment, any individual human might do something that no group had agreed to. It meant that treaties meant less with humans than with other species, because treaties were agreements between groups, and any individual human could simply decide not to honor a treaty and then act on that decision before any group process could catch up. It meant that the 11,000 simulations, however thorough, were always missing the variable of the one human who was going to do something no one had predicted because no one had told them not to, and even if someone had told them not to, they might have done it anyway. Veritsan had read all 11,000 simulations. They had also spent 422 days watching humans, and they had noticed something that the simulations had not modeled. The simulations treated human unilateral decision-making as a liability, a source of unpredictable destabilization, and it was also, simultaneously, the thing that made it impossible to contain them, because you could not negotiate with a species that did not require group consensus to act. You could reach an agreement with every human government simultaneously, and one human, somewhere, would decide that the agreement was wrong and act against it, and they would not be acting irrationally by their own standards. They would be acting exactly as their neurology had always acted, exactly as their evolutionary history had shaped them to act. exactly as every human who had ever done anything important in their history had acted. Alone, certain, irreversible.
Let me stop you here for a second because I want you to feel the weight of what's happening. The Galactic Federation, 7 species, 800 years of civilization, 11,000 computer simulations, looked at humanity and said, your greatest strength is your greatest danger. The ability of one single human to make a decision alone, without permission, without consensus, without waiting, this is what terrifies them. Not your weapons, not your wars, your will. And for 14 months, they watched Earth through long range sensors, waiting for humans to accept the reality of their situation, waiting for individual decision making to slow down, waiting for humanity to become more like everyone else. It didn't happen. Now something is about to happen on those sensors that the Federation's finest predictive models never prepared them for, because the humans didn't coordinate our resistance. They didn't select a leader or draft a unified strategy. They did something far more dangerous. They each individually, alone, made the same decision.
It kept Verithson up at night. Or rather, it kept Verithson standing at the viewport during the ship's rest cycle while their cellmates slept in comfortable adjacency in the resonance room, which amounted to the same thing. They were watching the feeds from Earth's northern hemisphere on the morning it began, morning ship time, which had nothing to do with morning Earth time, but Verithson had started unconsciously aligning their observation schedule with Earth's daylight hours, another thing they did not mention in reports when the first launch signal appeared on the sensors. At first it read as a single event. A launch plume from somewhere in the landmass the humans called North America, roughly mid-continent, with a drive signature consistent with a large cargo transport modified for deep space travel. Verithson noted it automatically, reached for the standard intercept flag protocol, and then paused. There was a second plume, northeastern coast of the same continent, and a third, southern hemisphere, the landmass called Australia, and a fourth, and a fifth, and then suddenly the sensor board was not showing Verithson individual events anymore. It was showing a cascade, a tide, a thing that did not have a category in the sensor board's event classification system, because the sensor board's event classification system had been designed by the Quorum, and the Quorum had never modeled this. Verithson stood very still. 412 launch signatures, rising from every continent, rising from open ocean, from a converted platform in the South Pacific that the sensors had been cataloging as an industrial installation and had apparently been wrong about. Rising from the polar ice cap of Earth's southern continent, a continent that the Federation's own survey data described as essentially uninhabited, and which had apparently been, for an unspecified period, not essentially uninhabited at all. The sensor board tried to calculate intercept trajectories and produced, for the first time in the deliberate patience's operational history, an error code. Verithson read the error code. Then they read it again. Then they did something that, later, they would struggle to explain. They laughed. Not the quorum equivalent of laughter, which was a harmonic resonance shared through the cell and which felt like warmth spreading outward from your center. A different thing. A sharp, short, private sound that they made alone and that no one else heard, and that they immediately felt was wrong, and then immediately after that felt was the most honest sound they had made in 14 months. The error code said, intercept modeling failure, trajectory count exceeds coordinated response parameters. 412 ships, going 412 different directions, at speeds ranging from barely functional to surprisingly impressive, with drive signatures that range from state-of-the-art military-adjacent technology to what Verithson's engineering analysis subroutine charitably described as innovative and less charitably described as held together with the human substances they called luck and stubbornness and wire. There was no formation. Verithson kept looking for one, kept rotating the three-dimensional sensor display, kept running pattern recognition across the launch trajectories, kept asking the analysis system to find the hidden coordination, the secret order underneath the apparent chaos. And there was none. Some ships were heading for the same general region of space and appeared to be loosely aware of each other. Others were heading in directions that no rational analysis of available habitable systems would suggest, as if the pilots had simply pointed themselves at something they personally found interesting and gone. Several ships were, in real time, on open radio frequencies, arguing with each other about where to go. Veritsan pulled up the frequency and listened. Told you, the Kepler 442 system has 3 viable candidates. There's no reason to aim for. Nobody's stopping you from going to Kepler 442. I'm going to Tau Ceti. Tau Ceti is 20 light years away in a retrofitted or freighter, Davrin. You're going to be dead before. Then I'm going to be dead going somewhere instead of alive going nowhere, aren't I? The transmission cut. Veritsan sat with the silence for a moment, then pulled up another frequency. Coordinates confirmed. We have about 30 minutes before the perimeter fleet has a response vector calculated. After that, we'll know whether they're going to. Does it matter? A pause. No, I guess it doesn't. Veritsan closed that frequency too. They were still in the observation bay. They had not called the consensus channel. Their cellmates were already awake. The sensor cascade had triggered automatic alerts throughout the ship, and Veritsan could feel, faintly, through the ambient resonance of the ship's systems, the collective alarm of 30 other quorum minds processing the same data simultaneously. They would be expecting Veritsan. The cell would be gathering in the deliberation room, and the absence of one member was felt like a missing note in a chord, and every second Veritsan remained alone in the observation bay was a small, private act of the severing. They remained. The fleet response, when it came, was exactly as Veritsan had known it would be, because the fleet response was what the quorum fleet always did, because the quorum fleet always reached consensus before acting, and consensus took time, and time was the one resource that 412 ships going 412 directions spent faster than any coordinated fleet could burn. 12 enforcement vessels, arrayed along a perimeter designed to stop a coordinated breakout, found themselves attempting to intercept a non-coordinated everything, and failing, because you cannot place yourself between an enemy and their objective when the enemy has 400 different objectives and has made no collective decision about any of them. 22 ships in the first wave reached the outer perimeter before enforcement intercepts could be calculated. 47 more slipped through gaps that opened when enforcement vessels moved to address the first wave. Veritsan watched the numbers climbing on the sensor board and felt something that their neurology did not have a precise word for. It was not the severing, and it was not the warmth of consensus, and it was not any of the 14 recognized emotional states in the quorum's internal lexicon. It was something that existed in the space between all of those things, pressing against the edges of all of them without fitting inside any of them. Later, much later, Veritsan would spend a long time thinking about that feeling and eventually arrive at the human word for it. Oh, they finally answered the consensus channel. The cell mind pulled them in with the particular gentle urgency of a group that has been worried, and Veritsan felt the familiar comfort of 30 other minds pressing against theirs, all of them processing the same sensor data, all of them generating the same collective alarm, all of them reaching together toward the deliberative process that would tell them what to do. The cell mind's deliberation took 4 minutes. This was fast for the quorum. For minutes of shared processing, shared modeling, shared evaluation of options, and the collective arrived at a recommendation that every member felt simultaneously, not as a conclusion reached, but as a truth recognized. File an emergency escalation to the Federation Response Command. Request additional enforcement vessels. Recommend activation of the Inner Perimeter Interdiction Protocol, which would tighten the containment boundary to the inner solar system and cut off any human ships that had not yet launched. Veritsan drafted the report. The format was standard. The data was accurate. The recommendation was exactly what the cell mind had reached together. They saved the draft and did not file it.
412 ships, no formation, no unified command, no single order that could be countermanded. Just 412 human beings and crews who each looked at the same wall and made the same private decision and went. And here is the educational truth buried inside the science fiction. Throughout human history, every system of control, every empire, every government, every occupying force has made the same fundamental mistake. They modeled their control on the assumption that the people behave as a group, that if you control the leadership, you control the movement, that if you make the cost high enough, the collective will back down. But humans are not a hive. There is no switch, there is no single node you can shut down to stop the signal. The Federation built a wall to stop a species. What they didn't understand is that you cannot wall off a trait, you cannot quarantine a way of being. Now, Veratson is about to access something he was never supposed to find. Not military communications, not government strategy documents, the things humans said to each other before they left. And what he finds there is going to change him in a way that 800 years of galactic civilization never prepared him for.
They did not know why exactly. They noticed the cursor on the filing prompt and noticed that it was not moving, and they sat with that for a moment, and the feeling they could not name pressed harder against the inside of their chest. The draft sat there. Accurate. Correct. Everything their training and their neurology and their 31-mind consensus chain told them it should be. They closed the draft. They opened the human personal communication archives instead. This was not a standard operational action. The personal communication archives, the civilian broadcasts, the private transmissions, the things that humans said to each other on open frequencies in the weeks before the launch, had been flagged for linguistic analysis but not prioritized. Veritsan had access to them through their cultural intercept clearance, which they had earned through 14 months of human language work, and they opened the first file without quite deciding to. The way you sometimes move towards something before you had consciously chosen to move. The first file was a video transmission. Human. Female by biological classification. Though Veritsan had learned enough to know that human gender was more complicated than the Federation's survey data suggested. Middle-aged, which in human terms meant somewhere between the biological peak of physical capability and the beginning of its decline. A period that humans seemed to regard with a particular complex mix of mourning and defiance that Veritsan had always found difficult to categorize. She was sitting in front of a recording device in what appeared to be the kitchen of a small dwelling. Behind her were the artifacts of human domestic life. A table, chairs, the kind of potted plant that humans kept indoors with an attention to its welfare that still struck Veritsan as remarkable given that humans also ate plants without apparent contradiction. She was looking at the recorder with the particular expression that Veritsan had come to recognize as the human attempt to appear calmer than they felt. She said, "I want to try to do this without crying, so I'm going to ask you to just let me get through it, and then you can ask questions after." Okay. She waited, as if someone was responding, though the transmission appeared to be one-directional. "Okay," she said again. "So, here's the thing." What followed was 12 minutes of a human mother explaining to her children. Children who were not there, children who would receive this recording after she was gone, why she was getting on a ship and leaving Earth. She did not call it heroism. She did not call it sacrifice. She called it, at one point, the most selfish thing I've ever done. And then she almost smiled and said, "But I think you'll understand when you're older, which is what I've been saying to you your whole lives, so why stop now?" She talked about the decree. She talked about what it meant to grow up on a planet that the rest of the galaxy had decided was a problem to be managed. She talked about what it did to a species to be told that your fundamental nature, the thing that made you you, the ability to decide things for yourself and act on those decisions, was classified as a cascading volatility risk. She talked about sitting with that word for 14 months and what it felt like, and she used language that the Federation's translation matrix flagged as emotional hyperbole, but that Veritsan's 422 days of watching Earth told them was entirely literal. Then she said, "I know I'm probably not going to make it past the perimeter. I know that. Your grandmother asked me the other day if I was scared, and I said yes. And she said, 'Then why are you going?' And I said, 'Because I'm more scared of what we become if we don't.'" 12 minutes. Then the recording ended. Veritsan sat very still for a moment and then opened the next file. This one was shorter. A man, older, somewhere in the demographic Veritsan had learned to identify as late career, the years when human productivity was declining but human wisdom was, according to their own cultural literature, theoretically increasing. He was outdoors. The sky behind him was the particular shade of gray that meant overcast in the northern part of the landmass called Europe. He was wearing clothing unsuitable for space travel, which told Veritsan he had not yet boarded his vessel. He looked into the recorder for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, in a language that the translation matrix identified as Polish, "I already said everything in the letter. I just wanted you to see my face one more time." That was the whole recording. Veritsan opened the next one, and the next, and kept going. There were thousands of them, tens of thousands, recorded in the weeks and months before the launch, sent to family members, to friends, to colleagues, to strangers on the open broadcast frequencies who had never met the sender and would never know their name. Some of them were elaborate, carefully composed, clearly rehearsed, the human equivalent of a formal document. Most were not. Most were the particular kind of honest that humans became when they thought they were running out of time, which was a kind of honest that very few other species ever achieved because very few other species held back so much ordinarily. They brought seeds. Veritsan had not processed that detail fully when writing the complication summary for their unsent report. They returned to it now. The manifest analysis from the human ships' declared cargo showed that an extraordinary percentage of them were carrying seed vaults. Not as food, as inheritance. Species of plant from every continent, from every climate zone, carefully stored in conditions designed to preserve viability for centuries. As if these humans, launching themselves at a perimeter they knew might not let them through, were thinking about the gardens of grandchildren who might live on worlds that did not yet have names. One manifest belonged to the vessel that the sensor array had flagged as hull designation ESS, 1943, which was the Federation's designation. The ship's own name, painted on the side in the large blocky letters that humans used for vessel identification, was St. John's Shore, which the translation matrix gave Veritsan as a place name, a harbor on the northeastern coast of the continent called North America on the island of Newfoundland. The vessel was a converted fishing trawler, 140 meters, diesel-assisted hybrid drive, an interstellar engine that Veritsan's engineering analysis subroutine assessed as functional and then, after a longer look, amended to functional, probably, pending several repairs that appeared to have been completed recently by people with more determination than formal training. The crew manifest listed 23 individuals. All human. All, according to the biological data that the Federation's survey records had collected during the initial contact period, over the age of 67. The oldest was 91. Veritsan read the crew manifest twice. Then they read the ship's departure log. The log was not standard. The Federation's contact protocols provided humans with a standardized departure logging format that enforcement vessels monitored. The St. John's Shore had filled out the standard sections, destination, declared crew, drive specifications, and then added, in the notes section that was technically for maintenance observations, a paragraph that was not a maintenance observation. It said, "We are the Newfoundland contingent. Most of us fished these waters before the waters changed, and some of us fished them after, and we have been leaving and coming back to this island for 300 years, and we know what it means to go out further than you should. We are not going because we think we will succeed. We are going because we are old, and we have already had our lives, and we would like to spend what is left of them doing something that matters more than waiting. Our families have been told. Our affairs are settled. We have Margaret Huang's bread recipe and 40 varieties of vegetable seed and one bottle of 25-year-old scotch that we are saving for the moment we clear the perimeter. If we clear the perimeter, and if we don't clear the perimeter, then we'll drink it anyway, because at our age there is no good reason to save anything for later." Veritsan read that paragraph 3 times. The cell mind pulsed against the edges of their awareness, that gentle, worried pressure of 30 other minds noticing an absence, noticing a silence from the member who had been in the observation bay for a very long time now. Veritsan felt it and acknowledged it. A small pulse of presence sent back through the resonance. "I am here, I am functioning," and felt the cell mind settle slightly, and then begin to wonder, collectively, why the filed report had not yet appeared in the consensus queue. Veritsan did not answer that question. They pulled up the tactical display instead. The St. John's Shore was at the inner perimeter. 140 meters of converted fishing trawler, traveling at a velocity that was, generously, approximately 30% of what the deliberate Patience's engines could achieve, in the company of 11 other vessels that had also not managed to slip through the first enforcement response and were now queued against the inner boundary waiting to see what happened next. The enforcement vessel designated Thoughtful Consensus, the quorum had a gift for names, was running intercept calculations on the cluster. Thoughtful Consensus was 3 times the size of the St. John's Shore and carried an interdiction array that could disable a drive system without destroying the vessel, which was important because the containment decree specified that human ships were to be stopped, not destroyed. The quorum did not destroy things if they could avoid it. Destruction was irreversible, and irreversibility was the thing that made the quorum most uncomfortable. Thoughtful Consensus would reach intercept position in approximately 9 minutes. Verith-san had the authority, as the senior cultural analysis officer aboard the Deliberate Patience, to delay intercept actions pending sensor confirmation of vessel classification. It was a narrow authority, limited to a maximum of 30 seconds, designed for situations where enforcement vessels needed to confirm they were intercepting the correct vessel type and not, for instance, a Federation-flagged civilian transport that had drifted off course. It had never, in the recorded history of the Enforcement Division, been used for any other purpose. The fishing trawler from Newfoundland crossed into the enforcement intercept window. Verith-san watched the thoughtful consensus begin its approach vector. They thought about the 23 people on the St. John's shore, all of them over the age of 67, most of them with fishing experience in waters that had changed and a breed of stubbornness that apparently did not diminish with age. They thought about Margaret Huang's bread recipe. They thought about 40 varieties of vegetable seed. They thought about the bottle of 25-year-old scotch and the complete absence of any practical reason to save something for a later that you weren't sure was coming. They thought about the woman in the kitchen, saying, "I'm more scared of what we become if we don't." The intercept order flashed in Verith-san's authorization queue. They entered the sensor confirmation delay. Maximum 30 seconds. The 30 seconds ran. In those 30 seconds, the St. John's shore traveled approximately 5 kilometers into open space on the other side of the enforcement perimeter. Not outside the Sol system. Not past the Oort cloud. Just 5 kilometers past the line that someone else had drawn and called a boundary, into space that was not anyone's space, that was just space. Old and enormous and indifferent in a way that Verith-san found, unexpectedly, more comforting than threatening. In those 30 seconds, Verith-san stood at the viewport and watched a fishing trawler from an island in the North Atlantic go somewhere it had been told it was not allowed to go. 23 people on a ship that smelled of diesel and old sea salt and the particular residue of 40 years of fish hauls, carrying seeds and a bread recipe and a bottle of scotch, going somewhere that would probably stop them and might not, heading toward a destination they had not agreed on as a group, because they were not a group in the way that the quorum was a group. They were 23 separate humans who had each individually decided the same thing for their own individual reasons, and happened to end up on the same boat. The 30 seconds ended. Verith-san released the authorization. The thoughtful consensus completed its approach. The St. John's shore was stopped 4 minutes later. Non-destructive interdiction. Drive disabled, vessel brought to rest, crew safe. The Federation registry flagged it as a successful enforcement action, which it was. Verith-san filed a sensor malfunction report explaining the 30-second delay. The report was accurate in the sense that a delay had occurred. It was not accurate in any other sense. They did not think about this for very long before setting it aside and returning to the tactical display, because the St. John's shore was one of 412 ships, and the enforcement fleet's running count of successful intercepts currently stood at 79, and the remaining 333 vessels were still out there, going in 333 different directions. 68 had made it past the outer perimeter entirely. They were in open space, outside the Sol system, heading for destinations that ranged from sensible to mystifying. The enforcement fleet had not yet received additional vessels. The emergency escalation that Verith-san had drafted and not sent had apparently been sent by other means, possibly directly by the cell mine through the consensus channel in a way that had not required Verith-san's authorization, which was standard protocol and which Verith-san had been counting on, but additional vessels would take time to arrive, and in that time, the 68 became 71, and then 74. And then the sensors showed a cluster of 7 ships that had been coordinating loosely on an open frequency, breaking into a sprint toward a gap in the perimeter that the enforcement fleet's attention to the fishing trawler cluster had briefly left unguarded. The gap closed in time to catch 5 of the 7. 2 made it through. 76 human ships in open space, heading for the stars. Verith-san filed that number in their observation log and then sat with it for a while. The cell mind was fully engaged now, all 31 of them processing the tactical situation with the particular rapid consensus efficiency that the quorum achieved under pressure. Not the slow, careful deliberation of peacetime decisions, but something faster and more urgent, each mind contributing data and each contribution immediately absorbed and processed by all the others. It felt, from inside, like being part of a very fast current, And it was exactly the right tool for exactly this kind of crisis. And Veritsan was participating in it fully on one level, while on another level entirely, they were watching 76 ships disappear into the dark and feeling that nameless feeling press against the inside of their chest. The additional enforcement vessels would arrive in approximately 36 hours. When they did, the perimeter would be tight enough to stop anything that had not already passed through. The 68 who had made it, 71, 74, 76, would still be out there, but they would be out there in a very large and very unforgiving universe with limited supplies and drives that range from excellent to optimistically functional, and the Federation's assessment was that the vast majority would eventually return or fail to thrive and be recovered. The assessment was probably correct, Veritsan thought, statistically, but the assessment had also said that Earth would comply with the containment decree within the first 60 days. The assessment had been run by the finest predictive modeling consensus teams in Federation history. The assessment had not modeled the fishing trawler from Newfoundland or the 40 varieties of vegetable seed or the woman in the kitchen who was more scared of what they become if they don't. Veritsan requested access to the full inventory of personal communication files from the pre-launch period and spent the next several hours reading and listening and watching. There was a pair of brothers from a city called Lagos, one of them leaving and one of them staying, who had recorded a 3-hour conversation that was about the launch only at the very beginning and the very end, and was mostly about their father and a joke about goats that Veritsan did not entirely follow but could tell was important. There was a teenager somewhere in the mountain ranges of the continent called South America who had apparently stowed away on one of the vessels without the crew's knowledge. This was confirmed by a frantic transmission from that ship's captain approximately 40 minutes after launch, and whose departure message to their parents was 12 seconds long and said, "I know you'll be angry. I know why, but I needed to see what was out there, and the window was open, so I went. I love you. Don't be angry for too long." The captain's transmission was considerably longer and considerably more alarmed. The stowaway was safe in a storage compartment. The ship had made it past the perimeter. Both of these facts appeared, from Veritsan's reading of the captain's subsequent transmissions, to be simultaneously a problem and not a problem at all. There was a woman from the continent called Asia, a physicist, who had spent 6 months prior to the launch working on the drive modifications for what the ship manifest described as a university research vessel, and what the actual ship appeared to be was significantly more ambitious than any university research vessel Veritsan had seen in the Federation's survey records. Her departure message was to her research team, the ones who were not coming, the ones who had helped build the drive and then chosen, for reasons ranging from family obligation to simple uncertainty, to stay. She spoke for 37 minutes, describing in precise technical detail every modification they had made and every reason she believed the drive would hold. And then at the very end she paused and said, "I want to be clear that this is not a farewell. This is a see you when we get there. I will be sending coordinates." The research vessel was one of the 76. It was also, according to Veritsan's drive signature analysis, running at approximately 40% above rated capacity and appeared to be going fine. Veritsan closed the last file and sat in the observation bay in the dark, the viewport open, the stars doing what stars do, which is simply existing with complete indifference to the things moving between them, and tried to write the paragraph in their observation log that described what they had observed. They wrote, "Human pre-launch communication analysis reveals a pattern that does not correspond to resistance movement communications as cataloged in Federation records. There is no evidence of coordinated messaging, unified leadership structures, or the rhetorical frameworks typically associated with organized defiance of enforcement authority." They stopped. They thought about what they had actually heard in those thousands of files. The 12 minutes in the kitchen. The man who wanted his children to see his face. The brothers and the goat joke. The teenager in the storage compartment. The window was open, so I went. They deleted what they had written and started again. Human pre-launch communications reveal that the majority of participants were fully aware that their launch had a low probability of success in terms of achieving physical escape from the Sol system. The decision to launch was made. And here Veritsan paused a long time before choosing the next words. Independently, by each individual, on the basis of criteria that each individual determined for themselves, for reasons that cannot be reduced to a single motivation, but that all appear to share a common structure: the assessment that a specific outcome was worse than the risk of attempting to prevent it, and the decision that the attempt was therefore necessary regardless of outcome. They stopped again. The common structure they had just described was, in the quorum's behavioral taxonomy, the definition of a rational risk acceptance. It was exactly the thing that the containment decree had been issued to prevent. It was, according to 11,000 simulations, the source of humanity's classification as a cascading volatility risk. Veritsan read the paragraph back. Then they added one more sentence. The quorum's predictive modeling does not appear to have accounted for the possibility that this structure of decision-making, while individually volatile, may constitute a form of collective resilience that is not analogous to any Federation-documented behavioral pattern. They saved the paragraph and did not send it. The additional enforcement vessels arrived 31 hours after the initial launch wave. They were 7 ships, all quorum-built, all crewed by consensus cells with the calm efficiency that quorum enforcement personnel were trained to project, and they tightened the perimeter around the Sol system with the methodical precision of a species that had been managing difficult situations through proper process for 800 years. The perimeter held. By the official count, 336 human ships had been intercepted and returned. 76 had escaped into open space. Of those 76, 11 had experienced drive failures within the first week and sent distress signals that the enforcement fleet had answered. Their crews returned to Earth safely and logged as enforcement successes. 2 more had been located by long-range sensors traveling in the same general direction toward a system called Tau Ceti and had been given the option to turn back or be intercepted. 1 had turned back, 1 had not, and the one that had not was small and fast, and had used the brief window of the negotiation to gain enough distance that the intercept calculation had, by the time it was completed, become impractical. 64 human ships in open space, heading for the stars. Veritsan read the 64 and thought about it differently than they would have thought about it 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, 64 out of 412 would have registered as a 19% success rate for a containment action that had been achieved with full force. Containment successful. Minority of targets escaped, majority returned. The 64 were an anomaly to be addressed in the next enforcement cycle. Now Veritsan thought about 64 ships carrying seeds and bread recipes and bottles of scotch, and 1 teenage stowaway, and a physicist sending coordinates, and people who had already had their lives and wanted to do something with what was left. 64 ships going to 64 different places, each of them crewed by people who had each individually decided the same thing for their own individual reasons. 64 was not a number. 64 was the beginning of a thing that had no category in the Federation's behavioral taxonomy. Veritsan filed their observation log for the week. It was thorough and accurate and described everything that had happened in language that was neutral and professional and in compliance with all quorum reporting standards. They noted the enforcement outcomes, the drive failure recoveries, the perimeter reinforcement, the status of the 64 vessels that remained unrecovered. They added, at the very end, in the supplemental observations section that was technically optional and that most enforcement observers left blank, the human population of Earth has returned to baseline surface activity following the launch event. Initial Federation projections suggested that a failed mass launch attempt would result in a period of reduced activity and increased compliance behavior consistent with the exhaustion of available unilateral action options. They stopped, looked out the viewport. Initial projections appear to have been incorrect. Surface-level monitoring indicates increased construction activity at 17 of the 23 primary launch sites from the initial event. Preliminary drive signature analysis of emissions from 3 of those sites suggests preparations for a second launch event. Veritsan saved the log, filed it, and then they did something they had been not doing for 3 weeks, the thing that had been sitting at the edge of every report and every observation and every 30 seconds of sensor confirmation delay, the thing that the cursor kept stopping in front of and then going past. They drafted a formal recommendation and sent it through the consensus channel to the cell mind. The recommendation was not for increased enforcement. It was not for tightened perimeter specifications or accelerated intercept response times or any of the options that the cell mind had been deliberating toward for 3 weeks. It was a recommendation that the Quorum formally request the convening of a Federation reassessment panel to review the behavioral evidence from the launch event and evaluate whether the cascading volatility risk classification remained applicable given new data. The cell mind received it. Deliberated for 4 minutes, fast, by Quorum standards, which meant they had all been thinking similar things. Then the cell mind reached consensus. They supported the recommendation. Not unanimously, for members had reservations that were noted and logged in the consensus record, but by the substantial majority that Quorum governance required for formal action. The recommendation was forwarded up the consensus chain to the Enforcement Fleet's Senior Advisory Cell, and from there to the Federation Relay, and it disappeared into the long, careful, deliberate process of Quorum governance the way everything did. Veritson stood at the viewport. The stars were doing what stars did. The 64 ships were out there somewhere, mostly beyond sensor range now, going wherever they were going. The enforcement action would continue. The perimeter would hold. The reassessment panel, if it was convened, and it would be, eventually, the Quorum deliberated slowly, but they did deliberate, would take years to conclude. In the meantime, Earth was building something at 17 launch sites, and the second launch would probably happen regardless of what the reassessment panel found, because the reassessment panel was a Quorum process and Quorum processes had timelines, and Earth apparently did not wait for timelines. There was something happening in the cold of space between this star and the others that did not have a category in Verithson's training or their biology or the 11,000 simulations or the Galactic Federation's 800 years of careful, deliberate, consensus-built civilization. And Verithson stood at a viewport that looked out at all of it and felt something they did not have a word for in any language they had been taught. They pulled up the last record they had of the St. John's shore. The fishing trawler stopped and returned, its crew now back on Earth and presumably either preparing for the second attempt or drinking the scotch they had been saving for a crossing they had not quite made. The final sensor image before the thoughtful consensus had completed its intercept was a standard resolution long-range capture, showing the trawler against the black with the dim star of the sun behind it. And in the image you could see, if you knew what you were looking at, the hand-lettered name on the hull. St. John's Shore. Named for a harbor. Going away from it. Verithson thought, they are going to try again. It was not a prediction from a model. It was not a consensus conclusion. It was a thought that they had alone, in the observation bay, in the dark, without anyone else's mind pressing against it. A single thought, arriving whole, and certain the way the human woman in the kitchen had spoken of certainty, not as a calculation but as a recognition, like something you already knew before you asked the question. They are going to try again, and the second attempt will be larger, because the first attempt proved something that the humans needed to prove to themselves, not to the Federation, not to the Quorum, not to the 11 enforcement vessels along the perimeter, but to themselves. That the trait that the Federation had classified as a cascading volatility risk was still there. That 14 months of quarantine had not changed what they were. That you could park a wall of stone at the edge of their solar system and they would look at it, and, eventually, individually, in the specific bone-deep way that humans decided things without asking permission, decide to go anyway. 64 ships were already past that wall. Verithson stood in the silence of the observation bay. The cell mind was a warm, distant presence, occupied with the consensus processes that had been set in motion, and for the first time in a long time the distance felt not like a malfunction, but simply like space, the ordinary kind, between one thing and another. They thought about what it would mean. Not strategically, not in terms of the enforcement projections, or the reassessment panel, or the second launch preparations at 17 sites. Just what it would mean. A species that had been told no by every authority above them had looked at the word no and done the specific human thing that humans did, which was not to argue with it and not to negotiate around it, but to simply continue existing as themselves until the situation that produced the no had changed, or they had changed it, or they were stopped and got up and tried again. A species that packed seeds for gardens on worlds they hadn't reached yet. A species that brought bread recipes and family photographs and one bottle of something worth saving for the moment worth celebrating, which was not success. Humans appeared not to require success for celebration, which was something that Verithson had noticed in their cultural analysis and not known what to do with, but simply arrival. Getting there. Being in the place rather than being stopped from it. The enforcement fleet was doing its job. The perimeter was holding. The Federation's processes were underway. Everything was proceeding as it should. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, a physicist was sending coordinates. Veritsan did not file a report about the feeling. There was no category for it in the reporting format. They saved it, instead, in the supplemental notes document that lived in the corner of their personal observation archive, and that they had been adding to for 456 days. A document that was not a report, and not an analysis, and not anything that had a name in the quorum's administrative taxonomy. It was, they had recently realized, simply the record of one mind noticing things and having no one to tell them to. They wrote, the St. John's Shore crossed the line at 0347 ship time on the morning of the launch event. It was stopped 4 minutes later. Its crew is safe and back on Earth. They wrote, I delayed the intercept authorization by 30 seconds. They wrote, I do not know what they saw in those 30 seconds. I know what I saw. They looked out the viewport one more time. The sun was a small star from here, bright enough to find if you knew where to look, but not bright enough to dominate the sky. Everything was the same as it had been for 14 months of watching. The perimeter, the dark, the stars that did not care about any of it. They wrote, they are going to try again. I do not think the number will be 412. I think the number will be larger. And I think that some of them will make it. Not because they are stronger than the wall. Because they are different from the wall. Because you cannot build a consensus-based perimeter around a species that does not run on consensus. They saved the note. Outside, in the dark, in a direction that the sensors had last calculated as roughly toward a star called Tau Ceti, a small fast ship that had used 30 seconds of diplomatic negotiation to buy itself an uncatchable lead was still going. The sensors couldn't see it anymore. It was too far. But the vector didn't lie, and Veritsan had been watching vectors for a long time, and the vector said it was still going, had not turned, had not slowed. The window had been open. It had gone. Somewhere else in the dark, the physicist was sending coordinates that the enforcement fleet would flag and log and have no practical way to use. Somewhere else, the teenage stowaway was in a storage compartment that was now, presumably, slightly more comfortable than a storage compartment, because the crew had clearly decided that a teenager who got on a ship to see what was out there was, at minimum, someone to feed. Somewhere else, the brothers from Lagos were having a conversation that Veritsan would not be able to intercept anymore, because they were past the sensor range, and perhaps it was still about their father, or perhaps it was about something new, something that didn't have a name yet, because it had never needed a name before now, because no one had ever been here before. 64 ships. And Earth was building toward a second wave. Veritsan stood in the observation bay for a long time after that. Long enough that the ship's ambient systems cycled twice. Long enough that the cell mind pulsed a gentle inquiry and received a gentle reassurance and settled again into its warm collective work. Long enough that the star called Soul moved almost imperceptibly in the viewport as the deliberate patience completed a small segment of its patrol arc. They thought about the quorum, about the consensus cell sleeping in comfortable adjacency, 30 minds pressing warmly against each other, all of them going the same direction because that was what they were. They thought about 800 years of federation, of careful process, of the extraordinary achievement of bringing 7 different species into a structure that held together and governed itself and prevented the kind of chaos that had burned through the earlier eras of this region of space, like a fire through dry grass. They thought about what it cost, what you had to be willing to not be, in order to be a member of that structure. What kinds of decisions had to stay collective? What kinds of going had to stay agreed upon? They thought about the fishing trawler and the 5 kilometers. They thought about the first and only time in their life that they had thought a thought with no one else in it, and what it had felt like, and what it still felt like when they reached back toward that 30 seconds in their memory, the way you might press your thumb against a bruise to check if it still hurt. It still felt like something. It still felt like the feeling they had not had a word for until they read enough human poetry and human letters and human departure logs to finally find it. It felt like awe? Not at the humans, exactly. Not at the fishing trawler or the physicist or the stowaway or any of the 412 individual acts of defiance that were, individually, improvised and impractical, and some of them frankly dangerous, and several of them probably going to end in hardship or failure or worse. Awe at the space that existed between what they were told and what they did. at the specific freedom that lived inside the gap between a law and a person who had decided the law was wrong, at the terrifying and extraordinary fact that an individual mind, one mind, separate, alone, with no consensus to catch it if it fell, could hold something as enormous as the future in it and then act on what it saw there. Without permission, without deliberation, without waiting for the current to decide which way to go. All at the severing, maybe, at the thing the quorum called wrong. Veritsan did not write that in the report. They did not write it in the supplemental notes either, because some observations were for watching, not for recording. They stood at the viewport with it instead, and let it be what it was, in the quiet of the observation bay, with no one else's mind pressing against it. Out in the dark, the 64 ships went where they were going. And in the long-range feeds that the sensors still kept running, patient and automatic, the harvest of data from 17 construction sites on the surface of the blue planet continued to accumulate. Drive signatures and launch prep signals and the ordinary electromagnetic noise of a species that had never once in its history, as far as Veritsan could determine, been successfully told to stop. On the long-range feed, the trawler from Newfoundland was long gone from the screen, stopped and returned and settled back into its harbor, but Veritsan kept the last capture of it in the corner of the display, the hand-lettered name against the black, and watched it, and thought, for what would not be the last time, they were beginning to understand. For what would become a thought they thought alone at the viewport on many subsequent nights in many subsequent months of watching and waiting and writing unsent paragraphs, a thought with no one else in it.
64 ships made it past the wall, not 412. 64, by the Federation's own standards, a 19% success rate, a containment action that largely held. But think about what those 64 ships were carrying: seeds enough to grow food on the worlds that had no names yet, bread recipes passed down through families, photographs of people left behind, and no one converted fishing trawler from Newfoundland. 23 people over the age of 67 who had already lived full lives and decided this was exactly what they wanted to do with what was left. They weren't launching because they thought they would win. They were launching because they had decided, each one alone without asking permission, that a species which stops trying has already lost something worse than a fight. Veratson delayed the intercept order by 30 seconds. 30 seconds that mean nothing strategically, 5 kilometers that change nothing about the enforcement outcome. But he filed a malfunction report and he stood at the viewport. And for the first time in his life, he thought a thought with no one else in it. That is the moment this story is really about. Not the 412 ships, not the perimeter breach. The moment a being who had never been alone inside his own mind looked at people who were always alone inside theirs and felt something his language had no word for. The Galactic Federation tried to ban humans from space. Earth launched anyway, and somewhere out there, a physicist is still sending coordinates.